December 16, 1944. 5:30 in the morning. The Ardennes forest lies silent beneath a suffocating blanket of fog and snow. Visibility extends no further than 20 yards, the frozen earth muffled, the pine trees skeletal and black against the white. Along an 80-mile front, American soldiers huddled in foxholes carved into frozen ground. They believed themselves safe. The commanding officers had assured them that this quiet sector, this ancient forest with its dense trees and narrow, winding roads, was a backwater, unsuitable for large-scale military operations. German generals themselves had called it impassable, tank-proof. The terrain was too rugged, the infrastructure too primitive, the logistics too nightmarish. No one attacked through the Ardennes in winter. No one with any sense of military science, anyway. And then the sky broke open. Over 900 German artillery pieces fired simultaneously, the sound traveling 20 miles across the frozen landscape, a rolling thunder that seemed to shake the very earth itself. Within minutes, 200,000 German soldiers and 1,000 tanks began pouring through the morning darkness. Operation Watch on the Rhine, Hitler's last desperate gamble. The offensive that would either save Germany or doom it forever. Here is the hook. What you are about to witness is the story of how an American general refused to believe the conventional wisdom about terrain, winter, and logistics. How he turned his entire army 90 degrees in the middle of combat. How he covered 150 miles through snow and ice in 48 hours to relieve a surrounded airborne division. But more than that, this is the story of what happened when American abundance collided with German desperation in the frozen forest. When two ideologies met not on the parade ground or the propaganda stage, but in the mud and snow of Belgium, where food, cigarettes, and coffee became weapons as powerful as any tank. Where the myth of the impassable Ardennes died beneath American snow. To understand what Patton would achieve, you must first understand what Germany believed was impossible. For 4 years, the Wehrmacht had fought across Europe. The generals had studied terrain, calculated movement rates, analyzed logistics. They knew the Ardennes from 1940, when their blitzkrieg had sliced through France with stunning speed. But that was spring. That was coordinated movement under ideal conditions. By December 1944, the situation was entirely different. Germany was fighting on two fronts now, and everything had changed. The Ardennes remained what it had always been, a maze. Approximately 4,000 square kilometers of rolling hills, dense forest, and ancient stone villages. The area possessed only a handful of north-south roads, roughly 7 main routes that all intelligence officers agreed were bottlenecks, death traps for any advancing army. The forest grew so thick and the terrain so broken that a single company of engineers could hold a division for days. The weather made it worse. December brought the kind of cold that broke equipment, froze water in canteens, and turned roads into skating rinks. German officers did not see the Ardennes as an opportunity. They saw it as an obstacle that could, if properly defended, consume any attack. But Hitler did not ask his generals what they thought. Hitler demanded the impossible, and his generals provided plans. The 6th Panzer Army under Sepp Dietrich would attack from the north. The 5th Panzer Army under Otto von Manschufel would attack through the center, directly through the Ardennes. The goal: reach the Meuse River before the Americans could respond, cross into Belgium's open plains, and drive toward Antwerp. The timeline Hitler's meteorologists had promised him was absurd. Bad weather would last approximately 7 days, they assured him. 7 days of fog, mist, and cloud to hide his massive buildup from Allied reconnaissance aircraft. In that narrow window, German forces would have to pierce American lines, navigate the Ardennes, cross 8 separate rivers, cross the Meuse, and then race 70 kilometers to Antwerp. All before American air superiority could be brought to bear. The entire operation rested on surprise, speed, and the assumption that the heavily forested terrain of the Ardennes would slow any American response for days. On December 16, that theory had its first test. German artillery fire rained down on American positions. American soldiers who had been assured this sector was quiet suddenly found themselves under the most concentrated artillery bombardment they had experienced since the Normandy campaign. The initial attacks fell on the depleted 8th Corps of 1st Army, men who were tired, understrength, and in some cases, raw replacements who had never heard a shell fired in anger. In some sectors, the Germans broke through immediately. In other areas, small groups of American infantrymen, often depleted platoons or even squads, held positions against odds that should have been impossible. The 2nd Infantry Division dug in at Elsenborn Ridge and refused to break. Farther south, scattered elements of the 8th Corps fell back but did not collapse. Within hours, however, the enormity of the German assault became clear. This was no spoiling attack. This was a full-scale offensive, not a desperate defensive measure, but Hitler's final attempt to alter the course of the war in his favor. The wedge that German tanks drove into the American lines became known as the Bulge. By December 18, the situation had clarified enough for the Allied command to understand what had happened. General Omar Bradley, commanding the American 12th Army Group, grasped immediately that something extraordinary was required. Patton's Third Army, positioned to the south and engaged in its own offensive toward the Saar, would have to be disengaged from combat, rotated northward, and sent to strike the southern flank of the German penetration. But how quickly? And how many divisions could Third Army disengage without collapsing its own lines? Bradley called Patton. Eisenhower ordered a conference at Verdun, a city that carried its own weight of historical tragedy and redemption. When Eisenhower arrived at Verdun on December 19, he was described by observers as looking grave, almost ashen. The atmosphere in the dismal barracks room was grim. A pot-bellied stove struggled to generate heat. The commanding general of all Allied forces in Europe opened the meeting with an attempted humor. The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us and not of disaster. The officers exchanged skeptical glances. Patton arrived having spent much of the previous night in conference with his staff. While other commanders came to Verdun with vague ideas and tentative plans, Patton had devised 3 separate operational plans, each one tailored to account for different scenarios Eisenhower might choose. He had prepared code words to communicate his orders quickly to his subordinates by telephone. He had calculated supply requirements, identified assembly areas, and coordinated logistics. An intelligence briefing was delivered. The situation was dire. The Germans had not yet been halted in the center of the Bulge. Some sectors remained fluid. Bastogne, the critical crossroads town that controlled 7 major roads converging in the southern Ardennes, remained American for now, but German forces were moving to encircle it. If Bastogne fell, the German army would have maintained the highway network it required. If Bastogne held but remained isolated, the American defenders would starve. Eisenhower asked his commanders for their assessments. How long would it take to mount a counteroffensive? How many divisions? When could they attack? Generals offered cautious estimates. Days would be needed to reposition forces, they suggested. Perhaps a week. Supplies would need to be gathered. Units would need to be extracted from existing positions carefully to avoid the American lines collapsing elsewhere. The mathematics of warfare, they explained, did not accommodate heroic timelines. And then Patton stood up and made his statement. It was a moment that would be recorded and repeated throughout military history. The exact words vary depending on the source. Some accounts say within 48 hours, others say within 72 hours. The core truth remained identical. Patton announced that he could disengage his entire Third Army from active operations against the Germans in the Saar, rotated 90 degrees on a battlefield already in contact with the enemy, and attack northward toward Bastogne. Not in a week. Not in 3 days. He would be attacking within a time frame so compressed that experienced officers regarded it as impossible. Bradley was incredulous. Eisenhower's expression tightened. Other generals shook their heads. It could not be done. The logistics alone, the supply lines, the ammunition movement, the truck convoys, would take longer than 48 hours to organize. The roads were congested. The weather was abysmal. The tactical situation in the Saar was too fluid to risk leaving gaps. Patton did not argue with their objections. He had expected them. Instead, he insisted with a conviction born from decades of command, he could do it. His staff had already prepared contingency plans. His divisions were positioned for rapid movement. His supply officers understood what was required. Give him 48 hours, not 72, not a week, but 2 days, and he would have the spearhead of his Third Army attacking northward into the German flank. Eisenhower eventually agreed, though he insisted on a 3-division attack rather than the delay Patton had suggested. Within hours of that meeting, one of the most remarkable logistical maneuvers in military history began. Third Army command posts displaced northward. Divisional orders went out. The 3 Corps, commanded by General John Milliken, was designated the spearhead unit. The 4th Armored Division, already bloodied in weeks of fighting, was assigned the mission of reaching Bastogne and relieving the 101st Airborne Division. The 80th Infantry Division would attack alongside them. The 26th Infantry Division would follow to widen and secure the breakthrough. But before any of that could happen, an entire army had to disengage from combat. The 3 Corps, which had been in contact with German forces in the Saar, had to break contact carefully enough that the German commander would not immediately recognize what was happening and attack the exposed flank. The supply convoys had to be reorganized. The ammunition magazines would need to be shifted from one axis to another. The field hospitals and medical personnel had to be prepared to move. The fuel trucks, the endless, gasoline-carrying convoys that were as vital to Patton's war of movement as blood is to the body, had to be repositioned. American logistics, which had evolved throughout the war into a sophisticated machine, were about to be tested in ways they had never been tested before. Third Army staff, under the coordination of Deputy Chief of Staff Paul Harkins, moved with organized precision. The work was methodical but relentless. By December 22, barely 3 days after Eisenhower's conference at Verdun, the first elements of the 3 Corps began their attack northward toward Bastogne. The weather that greeted them was a vision of hell. Snow fell in thick curtains. The temperature dropped far below zero. Ice covered the roads. The fields and forests were transformed into a gray-white wilderness where visibility dropped to a few hundred yards. German generals had been correct about one thing: the Ardennes in winter was nearly impassable by conventional military standards. The roads were narrow and slick. The turns were sharp. A single vehicle that skidded off the pavement would create a bottleneck that could delay an entire convoy for hours. Tanks that had been fine-tuned for temperate weather began to malfunction. Engine fluids thickened. Ammunition grew brittle. Frostbite consumed soldiers. Equipment that had performed perfectly in autumn turned sluggish and unreliable. The landscape itself seemed designed by nature to slow military movement. And yet the American columns kept moving. They moved not because the terrain had suddenly changed, but because the units pushing north understood something fundamental: speed itself was a weapon. To stop was to allow the enemy to react. To move slowly was to grant the German forces time to consolidate the encirclement around Bastogne. To hesitate was to guarantee that American soldiers already surrounded would run out of supplies, ammunition, and hope. The 4th Armored Division spearheaded the drive. Its commander, General Hugh Gaffey, understood the mission as a race against time. His advanced cavalry units pushed ahead, clearing German positions with brutal efficiency. The main body of the division followed, advancing sometimes 20 miles a day through conditions that should have limited movement to 5. Supply columns raced alongside the combat formations, keeping fuel and ammunition flowing. The logistics system that had evolved out of the Normandy breakout and the exploitation of France now achieved one of its finest hours. Despite weather, despite terrain, despite enemy opposition, Third Army managed to maintain supply lines that kept divisions moving and fighting continuously. The Third Army's Quartermaster Corps, working under conditions that would have daunted lesser organizations, accomplished something extraordinary. In 5 days of continuous operations, the Army shifted 63,000 tons of supplies northward. They moved 4,500 tons of ammunition per day. They established new supply dumps and logistical bases even as the combat was ongoing. They coordinated truck convoys, rail movements, and air transport. They did things that experienced officers said could not be done. Meanwhile, in Bastogne, the American defenders had been fighting for survival since December 20, when German forces succeeded in encircling the town. The 101st Airborne Division, which had been moved by truck convoy 100 miles in 48 hours to defend the critical crossroads, had dug in around Bastogne. They had taken casualties. They had been attacked repeatedly. they had endured German artillery bombardment. When German officers sent them a surrender ultimatum, the acting commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, had responded with a single word that would become legend: nuts. The American defenders in Bastogne endured by rationing ammunition and supplies. Medical personnel treated the wounded under unimaginable conditions. Soldiers rotated through the freezing trenches, many of them suffering from trench foot, frostbite, and sheer exhaustion. They expected relief. The radio messages from 1st Army headquarters had promised that Patton's 3rd Army was coming from the south. But days passed. December 21st arrived with heavy snow. December 22nd came with more snow. December 23rd brought slightly clearer weather. The weather actually started to clear just enough that American air forces could begin flying missions. C-47 transport planes dropped ammunition, medical supplies, and rations on Bastogne. The supplies fell from the sky, parachutes blooming in the cold air, descending onto the frozen earth where American soldiers gathered them desperately. But relief had not yet arrived. The German siege held. On December 26, barely 100 hours after Patton had stood up at the Verdun Conference and promised the impossible, the spearhead of the 4th Armored Division broke through German lines outside Bastogne. The lead element was a tank named Cobra King. The 5 men in that tank, First Lieutenant Charles P. Bogus commanding from the turret, Driver Private Hubert Smith, Assistant Driver Private Harold Hafner, Loader Private James Murphy, and Gunner Corporal Milton Dickerman, drove at maximum speed through enemy fire. They had advanced 150 miles in brutal conditions. They had fought through German roadblocks, anti-tank positions, and desperate last-stand defensive operations. And now, in the late afternoon of December 26, they were pushing through the final German positions. The resistance was fierce. German soldiers, understanding that their siege was being broken, fought with the desperation of men who understood their last chance was slipping away. Shells fell around the American tanks. Machine gun fire raked the column. But the Americans did not stop. They could not stop. Speed was their only weapon now. The Cobra King crew destroyed German anti-tank positions with their main gun. Infantry following behind the tank cleared buildings in pillboxes. The column kept moving forward at full speed. At approximately 1650 hours, 4:50 in the afternoon, the Cobra King tank linked up with elements of the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion, 101st Airborne Division, on the outskirts of Bastogne. The siege was broken. Within hours, engineers worked frantically to clear the road and secure it against German counterattack. By the morning of December 27, supplies and ammunition were flowing into Bastogne. Wounded soldiers began to be evacuated. The starving, exhausted defenders of Bastogne learned that they had held, and that they had been relieved. The impossible had been accomplished. But the relief itself was only part of the story. What Patton had achieved was more than merely a tactical maneuver. He had shattered a myth. German military doctrine, refined across decades and reinforced by the success of Blitzkrieg in 1940, held that certain types of terrain were unsuitable for armored warfare in winter. The Ardennes was the classic example, the terrain that should have been impassable for an army that depended on speed and coordination. Yet Patton's Third Army had not only moved through that terrain but had done so with such speed that German commanders could not believe the reports. German officers had anticipated that American response would take days. Instead, they found American tanks appearing in areas that should have been inaccessible for weeks. The American army had moved faster, fought harder, and sustained its operations more effectively than German military theory had suggested was possible. For many German soldiers who encountered the Americans in those final days of the relief of Bastogne, what was most shocking was not the military competence, though that was evident. What was shocking was the abundance. American soldiers fought with pockets full of chocolate bars. They carried cigarettes casually, sometimes discarding them when they were bent or crushed. They drank coffee that was actually coffee, not the ersatz substitute made from roasted barley that German rations provided. American field rations, the K-rations that every soldier carried, contained meat, biscuits, candy, cigarettes, and coffee. A complete meal in a compact box. The rations had been designed with the American soldier in mind, understanding that he would be fighting in conditions of extreme discomfort and that maintaining morale and nutrition were critical to maintaining combat effectiveness. German soldiers captured in the Ardennes reported seeing American supply dumps that were almost inconceivable in their abundance. Ammunition stacked so high that one cache would supply a German division for a week. Food supplies sufficient to feed divisions. Gasoline enough to move entire armies. The physical reality of American abundance confronted German soldiers who had learned to survive on far less. This contrast was not accidental or coincidental. It was a reflection of two different approaches to warfare. The German army had conquered Europe on the basis of speed, tactical excellence, and the mystique of the superior soldier. But by 1944, Germany was running out of everything: oil, steel, manpower, and ultimately, hope. German soldiers in the Ardennes were receiving fewer than 2,000 calories per day, in many cases, barely half of what they needed to fight in freezing conditions. Their rations consisted of hard bread, often stretched with sawdust to make it go further, preserved meat of uncertain origin, and endless supplies of ersatz coffee brewed from roasted barley or acorns. When they captured American supplies, they found something alien. Chocolate that was pure chocolate. Coffee that tasted like coffee. Cigarettes that were smooth and easy to smoke, not rough substitutes made from inferior tobacco. American soldiers casually gave away parts of their rations, not realizing that to German soldiers, these items represented a kind of wealth that no longer existed in their world. German soldiers of the Wehrmacht, proud men who had marched across Europe as conquerors, found themselves searching the bodies of dead Americans for cigarettes and chocolate bars. Field Marshal Owen Rommel had noted after seeing American supply movements in North Africa, "The Americans have taken to the desert not soldiers but organized abundance." That observation held true in the Ardennes. What confronted German eyes in those frozen forests was not just tactical defeat, but the visible reality of industrial capacity. For 4 years, German soldiers had been told that American industrial output was impressive but that the German army was superior. Now, staring at supply dumps and rations that seemed inexhaustible, they understood that the system that produced such abundance would eventually crush them. A young German officer captured near Bastogne was asked by an American interrogator what he thought about American food supplies. The officer responded with simple honesty: "We are losing because we cannot feed our men while you feed your men. We cannot supply our divisions while you supply yours. We cannot move forward because we have no fuel. You keep coming." That is not military science. That is just power. The American supply system that made Patton's relief of Bastogne possible was as much a weapon as any tank or artillery piece. The ability to move supplies, reorganize logistics, and maintain combat effectiveness in brutal winter conditions was the foundation on which Patton's audacity was built. Without supplies, without food, without ammunition, without fuel, the relief of Bastogne would have been impossible. But because the American system functioned, because trucks moved through the snow, because supply convoys pressed forward even in the worst conditions, because every soldier could carry a ration that included chocolate and cigarettes and real coffee, the impossible became merely difficult, and the difficult became achieved. The 48 hours that had seemed impossible when Patton announced them at Verdun actually stretched to approximately 100 hours when the relief forces finally linked up with the defenders of Bastogne. But the fundamental achievement remained. In the midst of winter, in the midst of terrain that German military science had declared impassable, in the midst of one of the greatest battles of the European War, an American general and his army had executed a maneuver that changed the course of the war. They had also, inadvertently, provided a lesson that would echo through the centuries. Speed and aggression, when combined with effective logistics and industrial capacity, can overcome terrain, weather, and even the best-laid plans of an opponent. The Ardennes, which had seemed impassable, became a highway of American steel. The snow, which should have paralyzed movement, instead slowed everyone equally, but American logistics and determination allowed the Americans to move faster than the Germans. The frozen forests, which German military theory suggested were unsuitable for armored warfare, became the stage for a masterpiece of mobile warfare. In the aftermath of the relief of Bastogne, both armies understood what had happened. The German army had launched its final offensive with real hopes of achieving something, not necessarily total victory, but perhaps enough success to force the Allies to negotiate. Within a month, that hope had dissolved. Bastogne remained American. The lines were restored. The German offensive that was supposed to split the Allied armies instead provided the opportunity for the Allies to inflict devastating casualties on German forces that were now operating in the open, no longer under the cover of bad weather. The Ardennes offensive cost the Germans approximately 100,000 casualties and irreplaceable losses in tanks and equipment. It did not cost the Allies dramatically fewer losses, but it achieved something more important: it shattered the myth that Germany could still wage meaningful offensive war. When German soldiers realized that the Ardennes, the impassable forest, had been crossed by American tanks in winter, they understood that their defeat was now certain. There was no terrain that could protect them. There was no weather that would stop the Americans. There was no position that could not be outflanked and attacked. The industrial machine that produced those chocolate bars and cigarettes and real coffee, that produced the supply convoys that kept Patton's army moving, that produced the endless stream of replacement soldiers and equipment, would eventually grind German resistance to dust. The relief of Bastogne in 48 hours was not merely a military victory. It was a symbol. It represented the collision of two worlds. On one side was Germany, a nation that had built an army of exceptional soldiers and officers, that had perfected the tactics of blitzkrieg, that had conquered much of Europe. On the other side was America, a nation that had taken the raw materials of industrial capacity, the manpower of millions, and the geographic advantage of an ocean between itself and the battlefield, and had transformed those elements into a war machine of such power that the Wehrmacht, for all its excellence, could not defeat it. In the end, the war was not won by superior tactics or exceptional officers or the courage of individual soldiers, though all of those elements mattered. The war was won by the nation that could feed its soldiers chocolate in the midst of winter. The nation that could move supplies through snow and ice. The nation that could produce enough ammunition that artillery could fire continuously for hours. The nation that could afford to lose tanks and build more. The nation that understood that warfare, in the 20th century, was not merely about tactics and bravery but about logistics and industrial output. The chocolate bar in an American soldier's pocket was more eloquent than any speech. It said, "We have abundance. We have organization. We have power. We have the industrial capacity of the most developed economy in the world backing every soldier in this field. You cannot defeat us." This was the ultimate lesson of the relief of Bastogne. Not merely that Patton's Third Army had moved with extraordinary speed. Not merely that an American general had refused to accept the conventional wisdom about terrain and weather and logistics. But that a fundamental transformation had occurred in the nature of warfare itself. In earlier centuries, military success had depended on tactics and leadership and the courage of individual soldiers. Those elements still mattered in the 20th century. But they mattered less than the nation's ability to produce, move, and sustain supplies. They mattered less than the nation's industrial capacity. They mattered less than the nation's willingness to commit resources to warfare on a scale that previous generations would have found unimaginable. The Ardennes had been called impassable. But it had passed the American army like any forest passes the seasons, transformed, crossed, absorbed into a larger story. And in that passage, German military dreams had died. The 1,000-year Reich would last not 1,000 years but a few more months. The impassable forest had become a grave for German ambitions. And in the snow and ice of December 1944, an American general and his army had written the epitaph.